Hey team, great to have you all with me. We're going to talk today about Diastasis Recti Abdominis, and we did a podcast episode on this quite recently with Anthony Lowe, and I'll link to that in the comments underneath. But what I want to talk about today is particularly the anatomy and biomechanics of the Diastasis Recti Abdominis. So I've got some things I want to say about the anatomy and biomechanics of particularly the abdominal wall, particularly the fascia of the abdominal wall, the Rectus Abdominis and the Transversus Abdominis muscles and their influence on diastasis. I'd love to have any of your questions or dialogue as we go through, and then I'm going to finish well before we're out of time, and I look forward to having a conversation and going through any questions or any contributions that you'd like to add. So diastasis I only learned quite recently. The Latin root comes from dia, which also appears in words like dialysis or dialogue, diagnosis, which means moving through or move completely through something, and stasis, which means to stand. So diastasis means to move through a stance, or in other words, the actual meaning now is to separate. So to basically move your stance. So diastasis recti abdominis is a separation of the two halves of the rectus abdominis. And the rectus abdominis muscle, as you know, is the six-pack muscle that goes down the front of your tummy. And it has two halves. It has a left half and a right half. And each of those is a rectus, or straight muscle. And the plural is recti. So there are two. And the diastasis recti abdominis refers to a separation of the two halves of the rectus abdominis muscle. And that happens to women who've never been pregnant. It happens to men, but overwhelmingly commonly it happens to pregnant women. So we're going to talk about that, particularly in relation to pregnancy. And the effects of these muscles, the rectus abdominis and the transversus abdominis, and the relationship with the abdominal fascia, and how that they influence diastasis rectus abdominis. The last thing I'd like to say, just to set the stage before we really get into the anatomy, is that in diastasis, the abdominal aponeurosis, the mid part of the fascia in the middle of the abdomen, is called the Linear Alba. Linea means line and alba means white, so it's just the white line. And it's not a white line that's visible from the outside, but on a cadaver you can see a white line because it's made of connective tissue, like it is essentially a tendon. And so the Linea Alba, the white line, separates, diastasis, separates. But I think a lot of people get the wrong sort of picture in their head when they hear that word separation. I think probably separation is not the best word, because the Linea Alba does not part. It does not lose its integrity, or put more clearly, it does not. There's no hole in the middle. It remains in one piece. It merely stretches. So when you picture a diastasis recti abdominis, don't think about a hole in there. Think about a balloon that is expanding, and as the balloon expands, it stretches. And that's in fact what happens to the Linea Alba in diastasis recti abdominis, which is it stretches. It doesn't actually, lose its structural integrity. So, let's start thinking about the anatomy, and we'll start out by drawing some pictures. There's basically a vertebra. Looks like a little fat pufferfish or something, but trust me, it's a vertebra. And there are your ribs. This is a top view. And let's draw in, well, here's your erector spinae muscles, quadratus lumborum muscles, multifidi. Okay, there's your psoas. Let's say this is the T12 maybe, your bottom thoracic. What else have we got here? All right, so here we have now your transversus. That's too thick. Your transversus abdominis. And the transverse abdominis wraps around inside like so. Okay, and its fibers run horizontally, and we'll talk about the fiber orientation in a minute. And then outside that, in a slightly different colour, we have the next layer of abdominals, which is the internal oblique. Internal oblique. And then the layer outside that in a different colour yet again is, of course, that colour's too similar, is, of course, that colour's too similar as well. I've got lots of different shades of the same colour, is the external oblique. We'll have to live with it. External oblique. All right, now I've drawn them with a little bit too much separation in between them just so you can, in reality they're much closer than that. I've drawn them with a little bit too much separation so you can distinguish which one's which. All right, so in between, or not in between, surrounding each of those is a layer of fascia, connective tissue. So each of those muscle sheaths is encased in a bag of connective tissue, which I guess I'll draw. I'd really like to draw it in white, but I'll draw it in kind of a beige colour. So the transversus no, I won't draw it in beige, it's too close to the colour of the muscle. I have to draw it in yellow. You know what, I'm going to draw it in green. Not true to life. So there's the sheath of the transversus abdominis. It surrounds the transversus abdominis muscle. Okay. And then it actually continues into the middle there, because otherwise the transverse abdominis would have nothing to pull on. It has to pull on the other half of itself. And then you've got very similar around the internal oblique and around the external oblique, a layer, a bag of fascia, a sheath. Okay, and they'll join in the middle, but not quite like that, because what we have in the middle here is we have the rectus abdominis, and there's your left and right recti abdominis. And so when the fascia now surrounds this, it actually kind of just goes around it, okay, and it encases those two halves of the rectus abdominis. Okay, so we often talk about the now let's see if I can, I'm not sure if I can, but let's see if I can make that any bigger. Apparently I could. Right, so we often talk about about the transverse abdominis being the deepest layer of abdominal muscles. And in relation to the internal and external obliques, it certainly is deeper. But when it comes to the rectus abdominis, I think it's quite dubious about whether the transversus is deeper or more superficial, closer to the surface, that means, relative to the rectus, because in fact it's kind of neither, really. The rectus is kind of in a separate little compartment there. The rectus is certainly not the most superficial abdominal muscle. It's kind of just in a separate compartment to all of those obliques and transversus. So that, I think, that's something that I find quite interesting. And this part here, which is in purple, is, so this whole part in here, all of that green stuff that's in that is called the rectus sheath. All of that green, it's not really green, but that fascia is called the rectus sheath. And dotting it was a little bit maybe excessive. And this part in the middle here is called the Linea Alba, the white line. And in diastasis, these two parts separate, leaving a thinner and somewhat stretched fascial connection in the middle. So it's kind of like when you blow up a balloon, the fabric of the balloon, the material of the balloon stretches. In fact, it's very, very similar to when you blow up a balloon, because that's a very similar mechanism. So is this all making sense? Do you have any questions at this point, or thoughts or comments? I'd like to dedicate this whole session to Renee for reminding me to record. Thanks, Renee. All right. So that's the top view, and that's pretty interesting, I think, because of those, this rectus sheath here and the Linear Alba is essentially just the various layers of fascia that surround each of those lateral muscles, the transversus, the internal and external oblique. It's just the fascia that surrounds those muscles that coalesces and forms this rectus sheath, of which the middle part, the thickening, is called the Linea Alba. So it's really just a continuation of the fascia on all of those. All right, a couple of things in the chat. Oh, thanks, Sean. And Julie says, why are Pilates studios more expensive than gyms? Julie, let me answer that towards the end, and maybe other people have got a view on that, but let's stay on Diastasis Recti until we're done with it. All right, so there is the top view of the abdominal wall. Now, if we get rid of that and think about the front view, let's think about just let's think about it just in terms of the body for a second. So the rectus abdominis, does anyone know the origin insertion of the rectus abdominis muscle? You can unmute or type it in, or even if you don't know it and you just want to take a wild guess at it, feel free.
Pelvis, and then it goes up maybe toward the xiphoid process or up in the ribs here.
Yeah. So which part of the pelvis does it attach to? Do you know?
Probably, hold on, near the foramen, I think.
No.
Higher up.
But what you said was correct as far as you went. So it attaches to, does anyone know which part of the pelvis the rectus abdominis attaches to? The symphysis pubis. Symphysis means joint. It's a type of joint, and pubis is the front part of the pelvis. So if we switch to the special overhead cam, we can see the pelvis here, and this part of the pelvis, this front part here, is called the pubis. This part up here is called the ilium. There's your iliac crest and your anterior superior iliac spine. Okay, this whole big section is the ilium. This is the pubis, and this down here is the ischium. There's your ischial tuberosity, your sit bone, right? So in reality, these are one bone, right? There's no actual joint between any of those parts. They're one solid piece of bone, but they just have different names for different sections of that bone. So there's the ilium, the ischium, and the pubis. And the joint between the right and left pubis is called the symphysis pubis. And we say it's a joint, and it is a joint, but it's essentially not mobile, right? It's I think it's called a fibrocartilaginous joint. It's basically just got an incredibly tough ligament in between those two bones, and it has very minimal amounts of movement available to it. So it's more mobile than if it was a solid piece of bone, but not much. And the rectus abdominis attaches to the pubic bone, right next to the symphysis pubis here. Right next to the symphysis pubis. So the rectus abdominis, its shape when it, so if we draw our little, whoops, if we draw our little pelvis there. There's a L5, L4, L3, etc. So the rectus abdominis, the fibers run like so, and they narrow down almost to a point on the symphysis pubis there. Probably drawn them a little too wide. That's lack of technical drawing skill more than anything else. That's probably better there. That's what the rectus abdominis looks like. And I reckon we can probably make that big as well, because we figured out how to make the other thing big. So why not this one? All right, so you can see they really coalesce down to a point. They don't actually join onto the joint itself. They join onto the bone adjacent to the joint. They're like that. And then you've got a little bit of fibrocartilage that joins those two halves together there. All right, and of course in between here is the, Linear Alba. And then you have the sheath of, say, the Transversus Abdominis, okay, and the sheath of the internal oblique and the sheath of the external oblique, and they all come in this way, and then they interweave around the rectus abdominis. So you have bits that go like this, and that's where you get your six-pack. Which you have, even if you can't see it, it's under there somewhere. We've all got one. All right. So the rectus abdominis originates on the symphysis pubis, okay, or on the pubic bone right next to the symphysis pubis. And does anyone know where the insertion, where the insertion is? I'll give you a hint, it's a rib. Do you know which rib? You got a 1 in 12 chance. Take a guess. How many fingers are you holding up, Amanda?
Is it the
Claire's holding up 5. Claire gets the prize. It's the fifth rib. Actually, it's the fifth, sixth, and seventh, but it goes up as high as the fifth rib. So if you just was thinking fifth rib, I think you'd be like 90%. You'd have 90% of all the important information there. I'm not sure how accurate I'm going to be able to be in my drawing of ribs, because ribs are kind of tricky to draw in my experience. But I can revert back to our skeleton friend, okay? And we've got 12 ribs, but the bottom two are not connected around at the front, right? So the bottom two just float out in space. Let's have a look at the back. You can see the bottom two ribs there. Are not connected to the front of the rib cage. And so the first 10 ribs are connected to the sternum. Okay? But the first 7 ribs are different to the rest of the ribs. The first 7 ribs connect directly to the sternum. Okay? Whereas ribs 8, 9, and 10 connect to rib 7 and then into the sternum. Okay, so in anatomy, we call the first 7 ribs your true ribs, and then 8, 9, and 10 your false ribs, and then 11 and 12 your floating ribs, because of that, different degrees of connection to the sternum. So anyway, the rectus abdominis connects up here into this kind of costal cartilage here of the 7th, 8th, and 9th and 10th ribs. And then it also connects onto the 6th costal cartilage, and then it connects right the way up here onto this kind of 5th rib, the costal cartilage, and the end of the rib itself of the 5th rib, which is on a live human, it's about there. Right? Like if you were going to wrap a towel around you after the bath, like that's kind of where you'd put the towel. Right, so it's pretty high up. We think of it as an abdominal muscle, and sure, it is in your abdomen, but it comes like right up, 3 or 4 centimeters from the base of your sternum, like above the base of your sternum. So it's quite high. And the insertion, the top end of it is quite broad. So where the bottom end kind of narrows down to a point, the top end is quite broad. So. And the fibers run pretty much completely vertically all the way up and down. I've got a fantastic picture of this in a book, but I'm not sure if I can show it to you with the camera setups and things that I have. All right, so that's the rectus abdominis, and hopefully you can form a picture in your mind's eye of that muscle now. Like if you just picture either on yourself or on a skeleton, in your mind's eye, those two halves of the muscle narrowing, tapering down to the bottom, and then, broadening out, and the fibers running vertically, okay, that they run all the way up, and then they kind of, the inner fibers, stop on ribs, 8, 7, 6, and then the outer fibers keep going up to rib 5, okay, which is about here. All right, and so you can picture, and I'm sure you already know, what happens when that muscle contracts, right? So if we pull the 5th rib and the symphysis pubis closer to each other, we know what happens, which is, of course, spinal flexion. So you're going to get flexion of your pelvis, lumbar spine, and thoracic spine all the way up to T5, right? But if you're pulling on the rib cage on the sternum, okay, well, the rib cage, you're pulling on the T5 rib, well, that pulls on the sternum, and the sternum pulls on all of your other ribs, the T4, the T3, you can't move your T5 rib down without moving the sternum down, right? So it's going to pull the T4, the T3, the T2, the T1 down as well, because as the sternum pulls down, like if we look here, right, here's the T5, okay, if I pull that down, guess what happens? The rest of the rib cage moves with it, right? So even though the rectus abdominis only inserts up to here, it actually moves the whole rib cage. It's going to flex the whole thoracic spine. All right, so I see many of you nodding, so I'm hoping that means you can make a picture in your mind of that. All right, so then we have the Transversus Abdominis. And transversus means, what does transversus mean? I've looked this up so many times and then forget it. Anyone got a quick answer for me? I just went to Google and typed in transversus Latin meaning. And it says transverse equals from side to side. There you go. I wanted to say that, but then I wasn't sure I was going to be right, so I thought I'd better look it up. All right, so the transversus abdominis running from side to side of the abdomen. And if we put that, if we go back to our drawing here and we get our pen back, and then we get rid of this, we will see that fibres of transverse abdominis run just about exactly horizontally. Okay, they run just about exactly horizontally. Probably I could choose a better, yeah, that's better. Just about exactly horizontally. And in fact, they probably stop more like there. Okay, and then this bit in the middle here is actually more the tendon of that muscle. And then, of course, well, maybe not of course, the transverse abdominis, if we think about it, wraps around, and we think again from the top view, okay, the transverse abdominis wraps around, okay, there is a left and a right, just like just about every other muscle in your body, and we call this the front, and this the back. Okay. Well, you've got your abdominal aponeurosis in the front. Okay, let's make this bigger again because it was better when it was bigger, I think. All right, you've got your abdominal aponeurosis, and then at the back, you've got another piece of fascia, which is pretty much similar to the abdominal aponeurosis. Does anyone know the name of that at the back of the body? So if I was going to draw the vertebra would be there. Anyone know the name of that structure there? Want to take a stab at it? It's called the lumbodorsal
sacral
Dorsal fascia.
Fascia, yeah. Lumbodorsal fascia. Depending on which part of the body it is, sometimes it's called the thoracolumbar fascia, if you're talking a bit higher up. So lumbo just means your loin, your lower back, basically. Dorsal means back, and fascia is connective tissue. So it's just the connective tissue at the back part of your lumbar area. And this is just the connective tissue at the front part of your lumbar area. So they're basically the same thing, just front and back. There is a key difference though between them, which is that this fascia at the back, I've drawn it incorrectly. It's not a perfect circle like that, like I drew it. It actually connects into the transverse processes, okay, of those lumbar vertebrae. So, and the spinous processes as well. Right, so basically connects into those vertebrae. And you've got, just like at the front, you've got, the rectus abdominis muscle in between here. Okay. At the back, you've got layers, different layers of this fascia at the back as well, and things in between the layers. So when the transversus abdominis contracts, okay, this whole thing is not the transverse abdominis. These are two separate muscles, right? So it's perfectly possible if you had, say, a stroke or something like that, for one half of this to become completely paralyzed and the other one to work perfectly fine, right? So they're independent muscles. They're not, they're just not a single thing. Just like your left and right hamstrings are separate muscles. So when this contracts, it's going to pull this end and this end closer together, right? Just like any muscle pulls its two ends together. And when a muscle pulls two ends together, well, and when it starts in a curved shape like that, of course, the laws of year 8 geometry, I think. Remember when you're mucking around with squares and triangles and calculating the area of a circle and that kind of thing? Okay, well, what do they tell you is the shortest distance between 2 points? It's a straight line, right? So it's going to pull in straighter, right? When it contracts, it's going to become straighter because to contract means to shorten, okay? And of course, that's going to happen on the other side as well. And of course, this part here is not fixed, right? That's not attached to bones or anything. It's just, floating around there. So this front part also gets pulled in. So this is what it looks like when transversus is fully contracted, okay? Versus if we did the phantom version, that's what it's like when transversus is relaxed. Does that make sense? All right. So we've got rectus abdominis. Whose fibers are vertical, and transversus abdominis, whose fibers are just about completely horizontal, right? So the fibers are at right angles to each other, okay? They're perpendicular. Perpendicular? Yeah, perpendicular. And then we think about the Linear Alba. Okay, and the transverse abdominis goes all the way down to the Symphysis pubis, okay? So pretty much similar to the rectus abdominis. The transverse abdominis goes all the way down to the Symphysis pubis and the inguinal ligament, which lives across here, and then goes all the way up into the rib cage, up to about the 5th rib as well. Right, so they've got pretty large, surface area. All right, so we've got these two muscles that have perpendicular lines of action. Right, so one pulls vertically, one pulls horizontally. Okay, one causes spinal flexion, and one doesn't cause spinal flexion, extension, or rotation. It just narrows the waist circumference. All right, so now we come to thinking about the effect of these, or the influence of these muscles on the interrecti distance. Or in other words, if you have a diastasis, okay, what biomechanical effect these two muscles each have on the diastasis. So let's think about that on the model. All right, so if we have our let's call that the right half of the Linear Alba. Can you picture it? Do you want me to put in a left half as well, or is that enough for your imagination? That one's okay? All right. All right, so if we put in the Transversus Abdominis, okay, which way would you put it? Which way would it be facing?
Horizontal.
Horizontally, exactly, Candace. Right, it's that way, okay? If I pull on this muscle, okay, what happens to the Linear Alba? It widens, right? It separates. And we can think about that in this picture as well. Oops, this picture as well, okay? If this muscle, simply pulls its two ends closer together, which is what any muscle ever does, okay? And this one also pulls its two ends closer together. Well, the force on the Linea Alba is this half is pulled this way and this half is pulled this way. Does that make sense to you? Do you have any questions about that? That's cool. All right. All right, so here's the slightly, possibly more challenging part, or maybe you're going to jump over that hedge really easily, I don't know. Let's think about the effect of the Rectus Abdominis on the Linea Alba, on the interrecti distance. Okay. I think we'll do that on the model as well. I think we're going to need a Rectus Abdominis. It's a bit longer. All right, there's my, it's literally held together with sticky tape, my sticky tape diastasis, okay? There's the two halves of the Linea Alba, each of which encases one half of the Rectus Abdominis, right? So the Linea Alba is a line of fascia or a bag of fascia encasing, well, not the Linea Alba, the rectus sheath is a bag of fascia encasing the Rectus Abdominis, and where the left and the right parts of that meet, that's the Linear Alba. All right, so if I tighten that muscle, if I contract that muscle, that Rectus Abdominis, okay, what happens to the Linear Alba? Again, we think the shortest distance between any 2 points is a straight line, so that goes from curved to straight, and guess what happens? It narrows the interrecti distance. Does that make sense to you? Or do you have any questions about that?
So, Ralph, if you strengthen the transverse abdominis, because that's the deepest layer and it's attached into the Linea Alba, would that reduce the risk of the Linea Alba stretching during pregnancy?
It's a really good question, and the answer is probably, but that probably applies equally to all of the abdominals. So we know there's actually pretty poor quality research in this area. Like most of the research is, very, very small sample sizes or poorly controlled or poorly randomized or what have you. But we have a bunch of low quality studies showing that women who do abdominal strengthening of any kind during pregnancy have less diastasis and it goes away quicker during pregnancy and postpartum when they do abdominal strengthening. And there's been quite a lot of research on, very poor quality, but quite a lot of it. And they've looked at a large variety of abdominal exercise. They've looked at, transversus training. They've also looked at just things like curl-ups and planks and leg raises and bird dogs and side planks and all kinds of things. And what they basically find is any kind of abdominal strengthening seems to be somewhat beneficial.
But people who do abdominal sit-ups, things like that, and have a six-pack, they're not necessarily targeting the deeper layers, are they? They may be targeting the more superficial, like the rectus abdominis as opposed to the transverse abdominis?
It's a very good question, and the answer is we don't know. I actually looked into this a few weeks back for a podcast episode, and it turns out that there's lots of research on what's the best exercise for activating muscle X, for example, right? So if you want to activate your quadriceps or your biceps or your rectus minor, whatever, it's like we look at, okay, how much is it activated in a squat and how much in a lunge and how much in a back bend and how much in a whatever. And then we can, say, okay, hey, if you want to target this muscle, these are the best exercises for it. And so we've got that with the abdominals as well. So we know if you want to target your external obliques or your internal obliques or your rectus abdominis, what's the best exercise? But actually that research has not been done in the transversus abdominis. And I'm just guessing, but my belief is, so there's lots of research on how to activate transverse abdominis, right? We've got hundreds of papers on how to do that. But all of that is basically people lying on their back with an ultrasound, machine on their tummy to activate the transverse abdominis. They're not doing like, okay, let's do a sit-up and see how much transversus abdominis activation you get versus doing some other exercise and seeing how much transversus abdominis activation you get. So we don't know, this exercise compared to this other exercise, how much or how little transversus is activating in any of those movements because it just hasn't been studied. And my guess as to why that is because transversus being the deepest layer of those obliques and transversus, you'd have to put a needle electrode through both sets of obliques into the transversus, okay, and then get someone to do sit-ups. And it's like, that's not going to be very comfortable for the person, right? You've got needles stuck in your tummy and they go, okay, now do sit-ups and we're going to measure. So I reckon it's probably just they can't get ethical approval or something to do those studies is why they haven't done them.
Right. But just one other question. Because the rectus abdominis is such a superficial muscle and the transverse usually works with the internal and external obliques, doesn't it? So my thinking is that if you targeted strengthening the transverse abdominis, then you're actually strengthening the internal obliques and the external obliques at the same time.
Well, just thinking about, so we know that exercises that challenge rotation and flexion at the same time are the best ones for targeting the obliques. So things like, unilateral exercises, so something like leg pull front, okay, where you're in a plank but you're lifting up one leg, fantastic exercise for both sets of obliques. Anything with a twist in it is fantastic for obliques where the twist is resisted. So doing these ones on the ground, actually there's not so much resistance to the rotation. There's a lot of resistance to the flexion. But sorry, I won't go down that rabbit hole. But so we know that the sorts of exercises that maximally target obliques generally involve rotation or unilateral movement combined with some element of flexion or side bending, right? And that's that's to maximally target obliques. But just thinking about like the action of transversus abdominis is to narrow the waist, okay? If you want to maximally recruit it, well, just cough, right? So, I mean, if you put your hand on your tummy, you can feel it, like spasmodically, explosively contracting. So the sorts of things that would recruit it, well, I would think like explosive, exhalation would be good, laughing, coughing, that kind of thing. The other thing is when you just thinking again from first principles about the orientation of fibers in the abdominals, you've got, in a super basic level, you've got rectus abdominis runs vertically, transversus abdominis runs horizontally, you've got your external obliques like so, and then your internal obliques like so, right? That's kind of a simplification, but it's basically correct, okay? That's the orientation of those muscles. And if you wanted to stiffen that structure, like if you wanted to brace your torso to lift something heavy or whatever, okay, do a plank or whatever, well, that would involve equal contractions of all of those muscles, right? So you wouldn't want to contract one more or less than the other ones. You'd want to contract them all equally. So just from a logical point of view, I would guess that anything like a plank or anything where you're sort of bracing in a static position, would probably recruit all of those muscles pretty much equally.
Yeah.
Transverse Abdominis.
Okay, thanks.
Good questions. Got quite a few here in the chat. All right. Candace says, how does this problem of separation impact women who've had hysterectomies? And Candace, I have to say the honest answer to that is I have no idea whatsoever. That's not something I know about. If I told you an answer, I'd just be guessing, so I don't want to guess. But it's fascinating, and I'll look into it. From Tina, when I was pregnant with my first, I did prenatal pregnancy, had no separation. With my second, I didn't do Pilates and did have a separation. So Tina, that could separation is more common with second, third, fourth pregnancies than it is with first pregnancies. So it may be that was going to happen regardless of whether you did Pilates or not. But it's probably a little bit to do with the Pilates thing as well, because we do see that in the research, abdominal strengthening during pregnancy does seem to reduce the size of diastasis and how long it takes to go away. So, yeah, probably a bit of both would be my guess. But don't beat yourself up about it. Patty says, how did genes weigh into this problem? My mother, 3 sisters and myself all experienced this issue. 2 of us had surgery to repair. So, Patty, I don't know, but my guess is it's probably pretty significant because your Linear Alba is fascia. It's connective tissue. It's basically a tendon. Okay, so it's made of the same stuff as your Achilles tendon or your biceps tendon or whatever. And tendons are made of collagen and elastin. Okay, 2 proteins that we manufacture in our DNA, or our DNA have instructions for how to manufacture them. And different people, there's variation between people in the relative proportion of collagen and elastin in those tissues, right? And collagen is a very stiff, structurally strong protein, whereas elastin is more stretchy, like its name implies. And so if you just happen to be somebody who's got a bit more elastin and a bit less collagen, that'll mean that in general you'll be more flexible and more mobile. And it also means that your tendons and ligaments are a little bit more flexible and mobile, which can be great in some circumstances and not so awesome in other circumstances. So, if there's also kind of a generalized hypermobility or even just more mobility, towards the more end of the normal spectrum, that wouldn't surprise me if there's a genetic link there as well.
Raph?
Yeah.
Why do we look at it as being a problem?
Yeah, this is really such a great question.
I listened to your chat with Anthony Lowe.
Yeah.
And I love the way he surmised about the intra-abdominal pressure.
That was a brain explosion moment for me as well.
Yeah. Mm.
So it is interesting that we kind of the underlying assumption behind all of his interest, I think, in diastasis is that it's a problem, right? And there's a fair bit of research on, that has found minimal or no correlation between diastasis and low back pain or, like pelvic organ prolapse or urinary incontinence or pelvic floor muscle function. People with diastasis tend to have weaker abdominals. But that's a correlation. It doesn't say diastasis causes weak abdominals. It could just be like people with weaker abdominals are more prone to diastasis, right? Like per Tina's point before. So the thing that most women seem to be most concerned about, and it's a totally valid concern, is it kind of looks funny, right? They feel self-conscious about the appearance, in other words. And when I say it looks funny, I'm not casting a judgment there. It's like that's what women say, right? And that's a valid concern. And really, exercise can't do much for that. Like I said before, we see that abdominal strengthening during and after pregnancy does on a population level, like, statistically, reduce the size and also the time for separation to go away. But there's not a single case recorded in a high-quality study of exercise eliminating diastasis, right? So pretty much the only option, if you really, really want to get rid of it, if you're already, like if you're less than a year postpartum, just wait, because it'll probably go away, right? But if you're more than a year postpartum and you still got it, well, probably it's like surgery or put up with it. Those are your options, sort of thing. So, why do we frown on it? Well, I think there's a lot of fear around it. And it's very interesting what Anthony said. Has anyone else listened to that podcast with Anthony Lowe? Right, I'll just quickly go through his point that basically, during pregnancy, the pressure inside your abdomen increases dramatically, right? You've got this massive uterus with a fetus inside, pushing out, right? So there's pressure pushing into your abdominal wall, okay? There's also pressure pushing down, there's pressure pushing out in all directions. It's like a balloon expanding in all directions, okay? And there's pressure pushing your uterus down into the vagina, okay? Pushing your bladder down into the vagina, pushing your pelvic floor, okay? And so Anthony's, and it's just speculation, okay? His idea is that, and I think it's a brilliant one, is that, well, a diastasis is could be like a pressure valve that lets off pressure from within the abdominal cavity and alleviates the downward pressure on of the uterus into the vagina, right, onto the cervix. So it might actually be a functional adaptation that reduces the incidence of pelvic organ prolapse, for example, or urinary incontinence. So it might be a good thing, right? It might be like, thank heaven I got a diastasis, not a uterine prolapse. Again, like I said, just speculation. Don't have any research on that, but just thinking about the anatomy and the physiology of it, it kind of makes sense to me that, and also the fact that at 36 weeks gestation, basically full term, basically 100% of women have an abdominal separation, right? It seems to be basically a universal thing. So, yeah, maybe it is just a healthy, functional, adaptive kind of, situation. Patty.
Raph, as far as it being, why do we look at it as a problem? I guess when you have it in all degrees. But for me, you're very vulnerable in that separation space because you don't have the muscles covering what's underneath it, really. And so I just was super tender there all the time and, just uncomfortable. Because how often, if you think about it, do we get, does something touch our stomach?
Yeah.
Like a lot. Mm-hmm. And so if you don't have that protection, I guess you feel very vulnerable and it can be painful and it's just uncomfortable, I guess. So, great. And it doesn't look nice.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. I appreciate it. And, really, if you're a year postpartum and you've been doing abdominal strengthening, the option is surgery or put up with it, basically. Not to say don't do abdominal strengthening, but it's probably not going to have any major effect at that stage. There is just a couple of minutes left, and there is one question. I think it's too long of a question. I'm sorry, Tess, for the 2 minutes that we've got. So I'm going to have to copy it and hold it over till next week with apologies. And there's also Julie's question about, all right, we've got 1 minute. I'd love to hear you guys weigh in on Julie's question, which is total non sequitur. Why are Pilates studios more expensive than gyms? Go.
Perhaps the training is more specialized, so you have to put in more time and preparation to teach somebody safely.
Yeah. More individualized attention.
Yeah, I would agree, more specialised. more specialised teaching, yeah.
Perhaps it's the way it's marketed.
I've heard that generally they take the PTs or the other trainers in there and very quick weekend course, and the trainers
Yeah, I think all of those. I also think there's probably something to do with supply and demand. Like there's just more gyms than there are Pilates studios, right? So if you choose a gym, you can go choose from any one of 100. Whereas Pilates studios, there's fewer options, and so less supply, therefore higher price, I reckon. And I was just doing some research on wages as well recently on Indeed.com, and in the US, Pilates instructors, the average wage is just about almost double. It's like 70% more than a fitness trainer. So, yeah, I'm not sure where that comes into it. Anyone else got any thoughts on that?
Perhaps smaller classes too. It tends to the studios I've been to, you know, you might have 6 people, where if you go to a gym, you might have 20 people in a class. So.
And also maybe Pilates is appealing to us like a more specific demographic, whereas gyms are more kind of, you know, for everybody. And really now I think a lot of them, because they're so common, a lot of them are just competing on price. Maybe that's part of it as well. All right. Well, thank you so much, everybody. I really appreciate your questions. I'm sorry there were a couple of questions I didn't get to, but don't worry, they'll go on the list. And I really appreciate all of your input. And thanks, Patty, especially for bringing up that last point, which I hadn't considered, about that sort of just being vulnerable and painful, I guess, tender. Never having had diastasis myself. So thank you very much. And if you've got a question in the interim or something pops up, you want to share it, just the Facebook group, this video will be housed. You can pop a question or a comment under there and I'll talk with you. Have a great week. See ya.